Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's panel, Pursuing Accountability for Mass Atrocities, What Can the UN Human Rights Council? I am Tasha Manoranjan, Pearl's Executive Director. Today's event is co-hosted by Pearl and University College of London. Many thanks to Dr. Kate Cronin-Furman from University College of London for her efforts behind this event and more broadly for her partnership in our push for justice. Today's panel will explore options for achieving justice and accountability for Sri Lanka's mass atrocities, including war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. It has been over 11 years since tens of thousands of Tamils were killed in what the UN called a bloodbath and what Tamils call a genocide. This discussion could not be more timely, as earlier today in Geneva, member states debated a draft UN Human Rights Council resolution on Sri Lanka, the shortcomings of which will likely be addressed by the panelists. Still, the fact that Sri Lanka remains on the Council's agenda 12 years after the peak of the conflict is a testament to the resilience of the Tamil community and its resolute and relentless pursuit of justice. From the mothers of the disappeared who have protested continuously for 4 years, demanding answers about their loved ones, to the journalists braving police brutality to report on ongoing human rights violations, and to members of the diaspora around the world. Before we begin, I would also like to take a moment to honor Maraba Sivaselvachandran, one such tireless advocate for justice and accountability. Maraba was pursuing dual degrees in law and business at the University of Toronto, and Pearl was fortunate to have her as one of our team. As part of our legal team, she worked fearlessly for accountability for Sri Lanka's genocide, and she was truly a gift to Pearl, the broader Tamil community, and the world. Maraba passed away just over a week ago, but her spirit and passion will always be with us. I'd like to now turn it over to Beth Van Schaack. Beth Van Schaack is the Leah Kaplan Visiting Professor of Human Rights at Stanford Law School. She formerly served as the Deputy to the Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues in the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the U.S. Department of State. Beth?
Great, thank you so much, Tasha, and let me send my condolences to you and your colleagues for the loss of what sounds like a remarkable young woman. We have such difficult times now, and I'm pleased that so many of you can join us to discuss these issues, notwithstanding everything else that's happening in the world. We need to stay focused on justice issues, and I'm sure your colleague would appreciate the fact that she was acknowledged in this way, and so many people here to discuss issues that she cared so deeply about. So as Tasha mentioned, the Human Rights Council, which is the peak organization within the United Nations devoted to the protection and promotion of international human rights, is currently in session. And in fact, delegates have been debating the new resolution on Sri Lanka literally this morning and as we're speaking now. It remains to be seen whether the Council will garner the necessary majority to maintain some measure of international oversight over Sri Lanka when it comes to efforts at justice and accountability. Just a little bit by way of background, there was a very important resolution in 2015, which is now set to expire. And at the time, Sri Lanka actually joined consensus on the resolution, voluntarily taking on a set of obligations to address the painful legacy of the country's brutal civil war, particularly the end of the war that saw the commission of systemic war crimes against combatants who had attempted to surrender, but also the civilian population that had been trapped in enclaves in the island. The resolution contained within it a number of promises, pledges to engage in truth-telling, reparation, and accountability. Very few of these, if any, have now been implemented. The current government, whose leadership was intimately involved in events at the end of the Civil War in 2009, has formally withdrawn from the resolution and has rejected a recent report from the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights investigative process that has been looking at contemporary and historical issues of injustice. And the country has witnessed a dangerous backsliding when it comes to sectarian violence, militarization, and a return to authoritarianism. The new resolution, whose zero draft, as we call it, is being negotiated right now. It's been called to be that the importance is to focus not only on accountability for the past, but also a return to violence in the present. So we have convened a really expert panel to discuss these issues, and I'm quite honored to be here and to be invited to serve as the moderator. Thank you to all of the organizers. We'll be discussing issues such as the Sri Lankan government's attitude towards accountability and to the Human Rights Council process, the victim and survivor community's perception of what's happening in Geneva and the effectiveness of international human rights pressure on the government, the role of the diaspora organizations and communities working with international organizations through the United Nations and elsewhere, pushing for strong rhetorical support from these institutions, and also the experience working in and with activists in Sri Lanka from folks who are from outside of the island, but who have also focused and have expertise on similarly situated states emerging from periods of conflict, repression, and authoritarianism. So our speakers will speak in the order in which I will introduce them. Then we will open it up for Q&A. I realize this is being streamed on multiple platforms, so feel free to submit your question onto whatever the chat function is on the platform that you're on. We will compile those and then pose them to the panelists after they've given some brief remarks of about 7 or so minutes each. So our first speaker will be Ambika Soodkunanatham, who's a lawyer and human rights advocate joining us from Sri Lanka. She served as commissioner with the National Human Rights Commission between 2015 and 2020. She's now currently a fellow at the Open Society Foundations. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Pablo de Greff, who served as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion of truth, justice, reparation, and guarantees of non-recurrence from 2012 to 2015. This is one of the UN special procedures devoted to transitional justice. He's currently a senior fellow and director of the Transitional Justice Program at the Center for Human Rights and Global Justice at New York University's School of Law. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Guruparan Kumaravadivel. Sorry, Guru, I hope I'm getting that right. I may have missed a syllable in there. Guru is the co-founder of the Tamil Civil Society Forum and founder chair of the Ariyanam Center for Policy Research, which is based in Jaffna, Sri Lanka. He served as head of the Department of Law in the University of Jaffna in Sri Lanka and has appeared as lead counsel in a number of cases relating to post-war human rights and humanitarian law in northern Sri Lanka. And finally, Dr. Madura Rasaratnam is assistant professor of comparative politics at City University of London and is the author of Tamils in the Nation, India and Sri Lanka Compared. She also serves on the board of People for Equality and Relief in Lanka, Pearl. Both of these organizations are the co-sponsors of our event today. So with that, Ambika, I'll turn it over to you to start us off. And thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Thank you, Beth. It's been a long day, so I hope I can be coherent. And thank you, Pearl and UCL, for inviting me to be part of this. So I have been asked to set the context, as it were, historical as well as current. So I would like to start with a question that I'm asked now every single time these days, is whether the only option for victims of the 30-year-long internal armed conflict is to seek justice through international mechanisms. I think the answer to this question lies in Sri Lanka's history and the nature of the Sri Lankan state, which has largely remained the same despite the change of governments. I would argue that our quest for truth and justice have been unsuccessful because we have focused only on the nature of governments and not on the nature of the state. That is, a majoritarian state driven by Sinhala Buddhist nationalism, in which the discrimination of minorities is normalized. Moreover, where ethno-nationalism motivates public policy making, the state and its structures are hostile to accountability, particularly wartime violations. As the victor of the war, the government of the day at the time, which is also the current government, attempted to impose its will on the conflict-affected community and forced them to adopt a Sri Lankan identity that was overwhelmingly Sinhala Buddhist, and in the process seemed determined to quash what the people view as their distinct language, culture, heritage, and history. This is affirmed by the current Secretary of the Ministry of Public Security, Sarath Weerasekara, who said, "Our culture of governance was centered with the ruling king. It has not fundamentally changed. Raja Bahavatu Dhammiko is the theme of governance by a virtuous ruler that we recognize, respect, and expect. This was also affirmed by the president, who took his oaths at Ruan Velisaya, a Buddhist sacred site that was built by King Bhutugemunu, who, according to legend, defeated a Tamil prince to rule over the whole country. The enactment of the 20th Amendment to the Constitution, militarization, curtailment of civil rights, they have generated a discussion on the state of democracy in Sri Lanka. During this discussion, we need to pay heed to current processes, both visible and invisible, that are changing social value systems and public perception in ways that undermine democracy and respect for the rule of law. None of these processes, however, which have been successfully harnessed by the current regime, are new, but part of a continuum spanning decades. For instance, state violence against minorities, persons thought to be a threat to the state, dissenters, human rights defenders, that has been the permanent normal in Sri Lanka for decades. And not surprisingly, the state has been hostile to holding any state official accountable for these violations. For example, police violence. So in 2018, the Human Rights Commission received 483 complaints of torture and 462 complaints of arbitrary arrest and detention. In 2019, 400 complaints of torture and 775 complaints of arbitrary arrest and detention. In 2020, we saw many cases of ill treatment by the police, including that of a 17-year-old autistic boy. And just last week, the brutal assault of a law student who is the son of a politician and a former governor. Now, mind you, this is not just from the North and the East, it's from all over the country, which illustrates the widespread and entrenched nature of impunity. So where state violence is concerned, often the focus is only on the individual. But the acts of the individual take place within a system that is deeply rooted in impunity. The extent to which impunity is entrenched was identified even in 1947 by a report of the then Police Commission. And yes, we do have a Convention Against Torture Act that criminalizes torture, but as citizens, we don't even know the exact number of persons who have been convicted under this act. Another element that is deeply rooted is the culture of denial, because the natural instinct of the state is to deny there is a problem in relation to anything, whether it's the economy or the environment. So you can imagine the extent of denial where the ethnic conflict is concerned. So the current government says there is no ethnic conflict. What we had was a terrorist problem, and it has been successfully resolved. When the memorial dedicated to the war dead in Jaffna University was demolished, the chairman of the University Grants Council, he released a video justifying the demolition on the basis that it's a memorial dedicated to war, which he said would be a hindrance to North-South unity. His attitude reflects the belief of the government and even sections of the Southern public that the conflict, as I said before, was not an ethnic conflict and a terrorist problem which is now being resolved. The existence of respect for the rule of law is an important element that illustrates whether justice is possible or not. The president's view of the rule of law is illustrated by his various comments. For instance, his comments to public officials in September last year, where he told them to take his verbal instructions as circulars. February 2020, when he said it is important that the judiciary does not interfere needlessly in the functioning of the executive and legislative branches of government. So when legal systems and processes become tools to be employed or dispensed with at the executive or the regime's convenience, the result is the selective application of the law. Law is weaponized as a tool of repression, and the marginalized and powerless are subject to discrimination and violence. My question to you is, in this context, do you think Sri Lankan institutions will be able to deal with wartime violations? These institutions also lack legitimacy in the eyes of the Tamil community because of the actions of the state, such as militarization, military acquisition of private land, non-implementation of Tamil as an official language, which has made Tamils feel that they are not equal citizens. Further, many of our institutions are also dysfunctional, and there is a lack of trust between the citizen and the state, and particularly the Tamil community and the state. But we must also pay heed to the connection between justice and democracy. Because even if we obtain justice from an international mechanism, we still have to find a political solution to the ethnic conflict. We still need to ensure dissenters are not labeled traitors and arrested, and civil society is not harassed for working on human rights. So what do we have now? We have a state which has little, and a government which has little respect for the rule of law, due process, or the human rights of its citizens. A state which does not view people as, and particularly a government that does not view people as citizens, but as subjects. When the government is at a loss as to how to deal with the messy and complex business of governance, it turns to militarized, repressive means to deal with the conflict or crisis. I would like to conclude with a few quotes, I think, that perfectly sum up the situation. It illustrates the government's opinion of international human rights law and the UN. February 2021, Defense Secretary Kamal Guruparan said of the High Commissioner's report, "It is full of nonsense, and I mean it. No other better word than that." Secretary of the Ministry of Public Security, Sarath Veerasekara, says, "This is a conspiracy, and the UN Human Rights Commissioner the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights is blatantly violating the Charter of the UN, and she cannot interfere in the internal affairs of a country, but she's doing that." Then Mr. Veerasekara also goes on to say that the disappeared, according to the international human rights law, that the persons who assisted the LTT are LTT combatants, and those who were killed during the war were LTT and not civilians. So what he is doing, he's implying that all disappeared and missing assisted the LTTE, for which they were killed, and justifies it by saying that they were all LTT combatants. Prime Minister Mahinda Rajapaksa says, "From the discussion that has taken place with regard to the collective punishment imposed on the army commander and his family, it becomes clear that the political divide in this country is between the patriotic camp, which puts the country first, on the one hand, and born traitors, who are waiting for the first opportunity to betray the country, on the other hand." President Gotabaya Rajapaksa in May 2020 says, "If any international body or organization continuously targets our country and our war heroes using baseless allegations, I will not hesitate to withdraw Sri Lanka from such bodies or organizations." Foreign Secretary Sarath Kolumbage, with no sense of irony, just a few days ago said, "We can't do anything just because someone points a gun at our head and says, okay, reconcile, it will never happen." But then this is exactly what Tamils are saying, that you cannot ignore our demands for justice and force us to forget and reconcile. In this context, my question is, do you think the mother of a disappeared person or the family member of a journalist who was extrajudicially killed is likely to see justice in their lifetime? We fear not, because, and I think it was like 70 now, today I saw Sri Lanka campaigners said over 80 mothers and fathers have passed away in the last few years without finding out the truth about the plight of their loved ones. Maya Angelou said, "When people show you who they are, believe them. I urge you to believe this regime when they show us who they are." Thank you.
Thank you, Ambika. Pablo, over to you.
Thank you very much, Beth. And I would also like to pay homage to the Pearl colleague that tragically passed away. Ambika said that she was tired and that she hoped that she would make sense. Knowing her, I knew that there was absolutely no chance that she would not. And in fact, it's very hard to follow her compelling case. I am tempted to say, I agree with everything that Ambika just said, and I have nothing more to add. I won't, but I do want to say I agree with everything that Ambika has just said. I will take the brief opportunity I have to say a few things about my experiences in dealing with the previous government in Sri Lanka during my 5 visits as UN Special Rapporteur, because I think that they may shed some light on current prospects. Of course, that was a government that was significantly, although not monolithically, but it had parts that were significantly much more sympathetic to the project of justice and accountability in the country. And nevertheless, despite that, very little progress in effect was made. And the little progress that was made is being dismantled by the new government as we speak. I do want to highlight some areas of progress because I think that they will be important in the future. And that is really to point out once again the extraordinary resilience of victims in the country, particularly of widows and mothers that have refused, as it happens so often in my experience in transitional justice cases, that women do a lot of the significant work and very difficult and risky work of keeping the transitional justice topic on the public agenda. So I think about mothers that have been demonstrating on the street now for 4 years. And I think that they show a lot of determination that, of course, deserves to be rewarded. And not just because of the extraordinary effort, and it does take extraordinary effort, but because they are standing for the idea, an idea that I think unfortunately still has taken very shallow roots in Sri Lanka, and that is the idea of the rights holder. As Ambika said, I think that the government has, and not just this administration, I fear that this is a more long-standing tradition, has the tendency to think of people not as citizens with rights and equal rights, but as subjects. But nevertheless, to return to another area of progress, I think that civil society in Sri Lanka made exemplary progress, and that the learning curve was extraordinarily steep. And here I think, for instance, of the task force that was in charge of the consultation process, working virtually on their own, without extensive transitional justice experience, and in record time, comparatively compiling a report with views that were gathered all over the country. And those are views about justice and accountability that are being forgotten very quickly, and that I would like to take every opportunity to bring to the fore again, because this was a very significant effort to gather people's views about what justice and accountability should mean. The transitional justice project in Sri Lanka floundered to a great extent, because it seems to me that a government representing a majority community was never willing to appropriate the project, to make it its own, to spread it, and to make sure that it was much more than an example of quasi-compliance, a very fortunate expression that Professor Cronin-Furman has used for a long time to describe Sri Lanka's attitude towards international obligations. Quasi-compliance is, of course, not a form of compliance, but a form of non-compliance. And different Sri Lankan governments have become experts at gesturing towards the satisfaction of international obligations, but in reality leaving in the ground things that fundamentally stay the same. And I think that this is unfortunate, and that it can be seen in the attitude of a good number of civil servants towards the institutions that they run and towards the people that they are supposed to serve. there is no more clearer demonstration of the lack of interest and of the institutional weakness of some of the crucial, absolutely crucial institutions in my mind, than the way that the office of the Attorney General in Sri Lanka has been structured and the way that it operates. And here I want to make clear that I'm not talking about a particular individual, but of a structural issue. It has been pointed many times in the past that the Office of the Attorney General, an office that is both the attorney of the state and in charge of prosecutions, will find it extraordinarily difficult to make progress in those cases when it is precisely state agents that are supposedly responsible for human rights violations. Despite the fact that this has been pointed out several times, there is very little action in this respect, just as there has been very little action with respect to things that were also pointed out repeatedly in the past: the weakness of the investigatory capacity, both of the police and the Attorney General, the dangers of the persistent militarization of Sri Lankan society. Furthermore, when the militarization is done by a largely monoethnic, both armed and police forces. So these are all signals that, because they are not new and because they were sent so often, I think that it is now time, as Ambika says, to raise not only a question about whether those institutions are capable of delivering, but of using the decades-long failure to deliver to take a different route. I think that the Human Rights Council, the report by the OHCHR and the High Commissioner takes a very, very strong and correct, in my mind, fully justified approach to the idea that it is time for the international community to try to use whatever leverage it finds in universal jurisdiction cases, in a resolution adopted by the Human Rights Council in its 45th session, Resolution 45/31, that gives the office a much more robust preventive function, and for the international community to keep Sri Lanka on its agenda in a much more forceful and robust way than it has in the past. I have run out of time, so I will stop here, but I think that it is now time for a different approach.
Thank you very much for that, Pablo. Guru, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. What I thought I'll spend the next 10 minutes on is first half to take my time to discuss as to why I think there is no domestic incentive for accountability and justice, and why it's unlikely that there'll be domestic and democratic incentive for accountability and justice in Sri Lanka. And the second half is to deal with how the Tamil community particularly engages with the difficult question of how why it pursues international justice and accountability, to reflect on some of the internal sort of debates and discussions around that question. So let me start with the first issue that I thought I'll address in this talk. Now, one of the major issues with the UN-led as well as international response to Sri Lanka's issues of accountability and justice has been to assume that the issue of accountability and justice is an issue with regard to a particular regime, and more particularly to the Rajapaksa regime. Now, I think this assessment, for example, not only runs through diplomatic discourses, but also in the UN human rights discourse. And I would say despite the fact that the OHCHR report of January 2021 is by far the best sort of assessment of the Sri Lankan, what the structural problems with Sri Lanka's engagement with accountability and justice. It still suffers from a diagnosis which seems to suffer from the problem that regime change can improve things on accountability and justice. For example, the narrative about the period between 2015 and 19, when Sri Sena Wickremesinghe government, the so-called national unity government, was in place, is projected as a period during which there was progress made on accountability and justice. Now, I think it's problematic to characterize it as such because, and as I've said in a number of places, largely the Sri Sena Wickremesinghe regime's approach to transitional justice was that it was a foreign policy management tool. That it wasn't because they thought transitional justice and accountability was good for its own good for Sri Lanka, good for envisioning Sri Lanka as a different place, but because they thought that kind of language and appropriation of that language was important to deal with the Geneva issue. It was very clear in the way that they were communicating to the South that this was the objective, and not necessarily because they wanted to see accountability. And this you will find in both the election sloganeering in President Sri Sena's campaign, but also in the UN peace campaign leading up to the August 2015 election. But even afterwards, after they co-sponsored the 2015 resolution, a comparison of, for example, Foreign Minister Mangala Samaraveera's speech in Geneva at the UNHRC session and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs language about the resolution in the aftermath of the resolution makes that very clear. So, for example, Mangala would use transitional justice language in Geneva quite clearly, but back home he would say that this is a victory for Sri Lanka. We've re-entered the international community. We are now a respectable member. And what has gone wrong is that the Rajapakshas have taken us out of the sort of, international community circle, and that we are putting Sri Lanka back. We are intelligently handling it. That was the language that was being. So the point that I'm making is this, that the reason why there can be the prospects for domestic accountability in Sri Lanka are slim is because there's no democratic incentive for it, right? Throughout the period of 2015 to 19, any initiatives that the Sri Sena Wickremesinghe government took, they do not own up to it for the reason that they felt that owning up to that, to even the limited successes that they were able to show on the ground, owning up to them would mean that they would do badly at elections, right? So, for example, while they did at least at the surface level reduce checkpoints, release some land, the State Minister of Defense would go to the South and say that this is not being done, that they are not removing camps in the North and East, and that they are being kept. So there was no democratic incentive then for them to own up to the success. And the only reason why they were doing some of these things, some of these quote-unquote progressive things, was to make sure that they could account to Geneva that there was some quote-unquote progress being made, and hence that this was a regime again that was that was equipped at handling foreign relations better. So I think the understanding of why international action is necessary must be rooted, must be understood in the political context that actually does not provide for a democratic incentive. So I've been asked this question a number of times as to whether more international action won't further solidify the current regime in Sri Lanka, and the answer to that is there is no other option. I mean, the opposition currently is not providing an alternative narrative to what needs to be done about accountability and justice, and they are largely being advised, and more evidently now with Dr. Jan Jayatilaka advising the opposition leader on foreign policy matters. It's there is no alternative in Sri Lanka in terms of what the narrative needs to be pushed as. So the main opposition, the main political party, does not provide an alternative envisioning of how Sri Lankan state should be envisioned, or for that matter, accountability and justice. So I think that sort of structural understanding of why there are no possibilities for democratic incentives for Sri Lanka to produce accountability and justice is very, very important. Now, the other point that I wanted to make is there are well-meaning people, friends of mine in Colombo, who argue that that the demand for accountability and justice threatens the possibility and concretization of democratic transition. That and so throughout 2015 to 19, we were told that if you keep pushing the accountability justice paradigm, that would derail the democratic transition that has been achieved, and to do so would weaken the possibility of Sri Lanka's democratic, quote unquote, the rainbow revolution that was achieved in 2015 to go away. Now, that kind of analysis is deeply problematic. But it is put out by well-meaning people, by people who believe in a plurinational Sri Lanka, who believe in pluralism, and that tells you also why the civil society in Sri Lanka is divided between the Tamil civil society and the civil society in Colombo, which prefers a more sort of softer liberal democratic forms of reforms towards creating more space, shall we say, for democracy, and fearing deep and necessary changes that will bring in the kind of structural sort of reforms to make Sri Lanka more plurinational. So that tension is not just there in the political class, but also in what we understand as civil society, and understanding that is also essential. So right throughout the period between 2015-19, those of us who are pushing for more structural reforms as being necessary to consolidate on the little that had been achieved in 2015-19 were asked, quote unquote, not to rock the boat too much, with the fear that the government would go. So that is something that we need to understand. Now, let me move to the second point, right? Now, it is in this context that one has to look at international. So for the Tamil community, I think the problem is you have the hegemonic and hypocritical forces of the West, if I may put it that way. Why would I say hypocritical forces? I mean, even for the Tamil people, they have experienced that the West and Petria's, the UN Internal Review Report, Petria's recorded this clearly. There was clear knowledge within the international community as to what was happening in Sri Lanka, and there was nothing that the West and the UN were willing to do to intervene and stop the atrocities, the genocide that is being committed, right? So the Tamil people know this very well. I mean, so the Tamil people have experienced decades of neglect, decades of hypocritical engagement by outside powers with the Sri Lankan government, and this includes India, China, not just the West. And so you have that, you have the West on the one hand, language and then so you're caught between the hegemonics appropriated the language of colonialism in international law, Russia, when talking about the resolution, where they are pushing back on any scrutiny towards Sri Lanka, right? And so there's been debate within the Tamil community as to the problems with having to find partners within this very difficult environment that we find ourselves in. And sometimes when Tamils, for example, make their demands very clearly, for example, framing the injustice and the oppression that they fell on themselves as genocide, for example, they are tutored to say, no, don't invoke the language of genocide because that doesn't sit well with the understandings in the international law or with the priorities of what their sort of naysayers in Geneva are trying to achieve for them, right? On the one hand, and then you have the Tamil representatives being used by powers that be to again contain the demand of the Tamil people in terms of what their aspirations are. And so we see this every year and out when Geneva comes in that Tamil representatives feel very constrained about what demands that they should be pushing. And the point that I wanted to make about the demand for examples and the sort of inherent complex and inherent contradiction that the Tamil community feels in making this is, for example, the demand for a referral to the ICC. And I wrote a piece recently where I explained that sometimes some of us feel that the demand for a referral to the ICC, despite the fact that we know that it's going to be very difficult for such referral to happen, is largely made to expose the powers that be for their hypocrisy. That, for example, in Syria, you can push for a UNSC resolution 14 times, despite the fact that you know very well that China or Russia would veto them. You would do that, but you would not do that on Sri Lanka because it's not important enough for you, or there are other further complicated geopolitical sort of, goals that you have that you won't do it. And sometimes I think the narrative and the strategy that oppressed communities need to use is to make sure that we take on the language of international law, we take on the language of liberal institutions that run, that pervade the international legal structure, so to speak, to be able to push further on some of these questions and push the international community to largely think about the hypocrisy of the whole system as a whole. So to rethink, for example, our system of international criminal justice, to rethink international human rights law. And right now, the Tamils are in a struggle, I think, to show the limits of the UN Human Rights Council. And I think the reason why we are still kept at the Geneva level and why this is not moving towards New York-based institutions, the UNSC, the UNGA, is because there is no political will at all behind those who want to still keep this in Geneva to really see a push towards accountability and justice. And again, right now, like we are seeing the zero draft resolution, the Tamils will be kept engaged with mechanisms that don't really have any real impact on the ground in terms of changing the lives of the oppressive environment that they find themselves in right now, but also towards delivering justice and accountability. So I think from my own point of view, that we have to see our engagement with international structures here as exposing the infrastructure that dominates us and that doesn't deliver us, but also to push the language in a way, to push these institutions in a way that there are communities like ours elsewhere, oppressed communities elsewhere, who are able to learn from these struggles and are able to bring in solidarity to change these institutions for the better. And I think it is that discourse that we have to keep and try to make better and better as we move on, if we are really interested in justice for all. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We have a couple of questions in the chat. Keep them coming. We're going to turn to them after our final speaker. Some of them I think have already been responded to, but I'll try and condense them so we have time to reach them all. Madura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Beth. Okay, so thank you to all the panelists and to the organizers also for bringing this event together. And I also just want to start by sending my condolences to the Pearl family. I recently just joined Pearl, and so I want to give you all a big hug after the loss that you've just experienced, and to tell you how well also you've coped with it in these difficult times. Okay, so I'm going to pick up from what Guru was saying and speak specifically about the Tamil politics of the politics of Tamil engagement, the Tamil struggle's engagement with the UN human rights mechanisms. Broadly, I would say I agree with everything that's been said before by Ambika about the characteristics of the Sri Lankan state, and by Pablo also about the clear need now for, for some sort of international mechanisms, given the clear kind of institutional failures of the Sri Lankan state. So whilst agreeing, I think, with Guru that, these mechanisms have been very hypocritical and have been sort of trying to contain sort of Tamil efforts for accountability and justice, I do nevertheless think that given, given the structures that there exists, Tamil political engagement, whether it's in the diaspora or it's in the homeland with the UN human rights mechanism, with a broad bunch of other international actors, is nevertheless actually kind of necessary and possibly effective, and is part of a long history of international engagement, of the Tamil struggle and of all struggles. The international has always been a contradictory and, contradicted place, with shifts and alignments that change all the time. So it's never really looking for principle or purpose, but looking for alignment and looking for possibilities. And so, the Tamil engagement with the UN Human Rights Council began in 2012 or slightly earlier in this recent phase, but it has a long history. If you look back to the 1960s, the Federal Party sought to appeal to the international community. There were delegations to the UN in the 60s and the 70s. And this is, part of a broader kind of structure of struggles historically. So I was just teaching a class actually on India and the anti-colonial struggle and Gandhi's famous Salt March, which was not addressed to the British at all. It was addressed to a global audience, so that every day he would give press conferences to reporters from all over the world to try and get the message out. And you can see the Mothers of the Disappeared doing pretty much the same thing in the same resilient kind of a way, same resilient, determined kind of a way. So there's a kind of long history of that, of efforts to reach out to the contradicted, and contradictory international to try and alleviate present conditions of oppression. In the Tamil struggle, it goes back several decades and in struggles all over the world. But I will just I do want to end by saying for me, if I look at it structurally, I'm a political scientist, I think there are possibilities for this struggle to be effective. I agree with Guru in the sense that it's the kind of the narrow politics of the wording often takes us away from the demands that are coming from the grassroots, from the diaspora. But if we take a step back and just say that getting Sri Lanka onto the international agenda, getting international focus and attention on Sri Lanka, if that is the strategic objective or part of the strategic objective, we are heading in the right direction, because we keep talking about Sri Lanka, we keep bringing light to these matters every year. That is why we call it a struggle. It's a long struggle. It's it's a kind of chronic condition of pushing and pushing and pushing. And I think that pressure is effective for a number of reasons. I think that Sri Lanka's kind of international standing and credibility is something that Sinhala Buddhist leaders, even the most kind of hard line of them, including the ones that Ambika quoted at the beginning, are very sensitive to this pressure for lots of good reasons, right? So at the moment, we all know that Sri Lanka is in extreme financial distress, in a very, very precarious position in terms of debt repayments. And this kind of undue attention, fluctuations in attention, suddenly Sri Lanka is in the spotlight. It has effects on credit ratings. It has effects on the everyday capacity of the state to reproduce itself. So for those reasons, from the Mothers of the Disappeared to the credit rating agencies to the capacity of these military leaders to do what they want, there are links, and we can work to strengthen those links and push those links further. And also, this is a state that is very sensitive, including these leaders, to their international image. Think about the importance of cricket. Think about the importance of these other kind of images that they like to push. So I would say that while I teach international politics, I have no kind of no illusions about what kind of possibilities are going to be immediately apparent. Nevertheless, when I look back historically, it's not surprising to me that a broad coalition of activists, Tamil and non-Tamil, are working so hard to push this in the international agenda, because that is what the Tamil struggle has done for decades. That's what other struggles have done for decades. And yes, more strategically, that we can think about the way in which international laws can be reformed, but also tactically, we also have to think about keeping Sri Lanka on the agenda, keeping it in place, sustaining that focus and sustaining that attention over the years to come. Okay, thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you. So we'll now turn to Q&A. I've just put in the chat a link to a symposium that the Just Security blog is hosting on engagement in and around Sri Lanka in the Human Rights Council. Some of our participants this morning have contributions to that symposium, so I would recommend it to you. I'd like to give the floor to Dr. Cronin-Fernan as one of our organizers to pose the first question, and then I'll pull the rest of the questions from the chat. Kate, over to you.
Yep, wonderful. Thank you, Beth. Thank you to all the panelists. This was fantastic. And I also want to say thank you to Pearl for co-organizing this under really difficult circumstances this week. So I think this was incredibly valuable, because so often when we talk about hard cases for human rights, hard cases for accountability for mass atrocities, we tend to focus on two-way relationships. So the relationship between the state and the international community, the relationship between the victims and the state, relationship between victims and the international community. I think it's really useful that here we have the whole system laid out for us, right, in the panelists' remarks, and how these are kind of all interacting with each other in, creating a very, very complex, very difficult circumstance. So Ambika and Guru have laid out for us a very clear account of structure, right? These are human rights abuses. This is impunity that is the product of longstanding structures. There's absolute political unwillingness to engage. Pablo has kind of echoed this perception from the international's eye view of seeing a state and indeed kind of successive regimes that are just not willing to kind of move particularly far on human rights. So I want to echo and perhaps sharpen the question that Guru asked about whether there is anything else to be gotten from the Geneva process, from the UN Human Rights Council. And the reason that I want to echo this is that this is a system that is premised on cooperation, right? So unlike the New York institutions, or specifically the Security Council and to some extent the International Criminal Court, the UN Human Rights Council does not really have the capacity to act against a state's interests, and that's baked in, that's the design. So, Guru pointed out for us that the last administration in Sri Lanka frequently kind of strategically deployed the language of human rights on the international stage as a time-buying exercise. Pablo has written about this and spoken about this as well. We see the current administration doing this in a way too, right? So we've heard multiple representatives of the Rajapaksa regime out in the media in the last week or two saying something to the effect of, show us the evidence, right? Where is the evidence of these 40,000, 70,000 deaths? Where is the evidence of these missing people? And that is also a strategic engagement with the language of human rights and a time-buying exercise. So given that they have kind of cottoned on to the usefulness of that, and given that the UN Human Rights Council is sort of fundamentally incapable of acting in a way that is not, to some extent, deferential to state preferences and state willingness to engage, does continued action at Geneva just empower this behavior, right? Are we just setting up a continuous feedback loop where successive Sri Lankan regimes, other similarly situated states are able to do the same thing? Or is there something productive that can be done in response to this? And I will stop there.
Feel free, anyone, to jump in. I don't think that was, I think it was directed to all of you.
Okay, so if I may very briefly, I think Madura is right in thinking that despite all the flaws, there is still a point, Kate. First, I mean, there's a sad issue about lack of alternatives. No, it's not that there are very clear avenues to pursue accountability within the UN system, outside topics of accountability within the UN system, outside the Human Rights Council, reaching the Security Council just for a discussion involves crossing a huge threshold. Having a successful discussion at the Security Council, one that leads to decisions, is even harder given current geopolitical circumstances. So I think that there is something inevitable about persisting in Geneva. A bit more positively, I think that there are side effects of the efforts at Geneva that are worth keeping in mind. That Geneva coalesces and crystallizes and can catalyze processes of support for accountability causes that we have seen in the past, and that is a hope that I don't think that one should abandon. And finally, there is some dynamism in the system. I mentioned the resolution adopted in the 45th session as a result of work trying to strengthen the preventive function of the Human Rights Council. And although, of course, I am under no illusion about this bearing fruits quickly, I think that there is some dynamism in the system and that one should try to take advantage of the openings and crevices that slow movement generates. So a lot more to be said, but I would say it would be a mistake to abandon Geneva, despite the fact that I concur it has shown very little results. But I think that now it's not the time to give up on it.
Anyone else want to weigh in before I go to the next question?
Yes.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. Just a quick remark. Yeah, I mean, I would agree that there are side effects that are helpful, and I would also say that, you know, the Sri Lankan government has a long history of engaging with the human rights framework, right? So throughout the war, throughout the 90s, special rapporteurs were always invited to Sri Lanka to visit and produce report after report. There was a famous report from Amnesty International in 2009 saying 20 years of make-believe. So there had been 20 years of engagement, right? Of writing reports, setting up panels. I mean, the Office for Missing Persons is not new. We've had this since, in my memory, at least since the mid-90s, right? When the mass graves at Chemmani were found. So, you know, some institutional mechanism. But what is different about it now is that there is, you know, if you look back at Sri Lanka's history, there is now a report by the UN that the Sri Lankan government has also accepted that says mass atrocities were committed. It's a benchmark. We can't go below that now, because a Sri Lankan government that might be called traitorous by subsequent Sri Lankan government, but nevertheless a Sri Lankan government holding its rightful place in the UN, in a UN system, has said, okay, yes, that happened according to the report that you've just written. And it may seem like a small thing for so much effort, but if you look back at Sri Lanka's history, that seems like a lot more than has been there previously. So it's a bar. It's not as high as we would like, but, you know, in my view, we can build.
I mean, quickly, I think I understand the frustrations of, you know, victims and in a way, the Human Rights Council, it seems like you're just producing report after report. And if you are able to kind of bump it up, then all well and good. But I don't necessarily agree that having it at the council means that you can't try the other options, because having worked with a large number of victims, I also know that while they want accountability and they want ICC referral, they also want these reports. They, like, even the special procedures. I have helped so many families draft the letters. I've explained the process to them. And sometimes they do say, what is the point? But they're still pleased. I mean, they get nothing, but there is some, I don't know, very minute relief they get when they see their name on that report and it's documented, it's not forgotten. That matters. So it's paradoxical. When you deal with people and loss and pain, it is not an either or option sometimes, it's far more complicated. So I think it's not an easy answer to say, just let's drop this and yeah, it's complicated.
Sorry, Beth, I'll take just 1 minute. I have a slightly different response. I'm not devaluing the UNHRC and its processes and the impact that it has on the discourse and sometimes also in real lives. For example, I mean, I don't know whether the forced cremation thing is over yet, but at least we know that UNHRC and the process has had an impact. But what are we settling for is the question, right? I mean, so the Sri Lankan government, so take, for example, the approach that they're taking. So today, Sri Lanka took part in the informal discussions, right? I mean, they thought that the Sri Lankan ambassador won't come, but Chandra Peruma came, right? Now, why do they want to engage with this process? In fact, they stand to benefit with the resolution that is being passed because they'll go back and tell their constituency saying, here is the West coming after us and further solidifies their base, right? It's a win-win situation for them. If the resolution is defeated, it's still a win. If it passes, it's still a win. It's political capital still for them, right? I mean, I mean, and Sri Lanka is, and if you look at the Sri Lankan state, if you don't look at just the Rajapaksa regime's point of view in this, it is punctuated with the Kadarkhamers and the Samaraveeras in the middle, right? Who will come and give an infusion that, you know, we are a democratic state, we are not that sort of totally out of sort of focus state, and still maintain Sri Lanka as some respectable member of the community, which will go and sort of continuing that cycle. And the Sri Lankan state can continue like this forever, whereas the structural conditions in which the numerically smaller communities find themselves keep reproducing the same kind of, you know, oppressive outcomes, which don't change overall. And that, I think, is my problem, and that is something that we shouldn't keep feeding on.
Great, thank you. We're going to go a little long. If people need to drop off, totally understandable, but we do have some questions in the queue that I think it's important to get to. I'd like to invite two folks who have joined us live to take turns unmuting themselves and pose their questions, and then maybe we can do another round of answers. And then I've got one or two more questions, and then we'll close in 15 minutes with a hard stop. So I would like to invite Gowrie and Melissa, maybe in that order, to unmute themselves and pose their questions back to back, and then we'll have a round of answers.
Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to the panelists. My question is, the international community seemed to overwhelmingly take a wait and see approach to accountability throughout the years of the Sirisena government. And given the developments and public statements made by the current Rajapaksa government, do you think we will see an end to this wait and see approach, particularly at this UNHRC session?
Great, and then Melissa?
Thank you, Beth, and thank you to the organisers for the event. My question is, what kinds of international pressure do the panellists think are most effective to influence the Sri Lankan government and to help protect victims and survivors who continue to speak out in spite of the risks to their safety? Do you think that sanctions against individuals, economic leverage through trade and aid, or halting engagement with Sri Lankan institutions like the military are effective? Thank you.
Over to the panelists. So is the sign of a good question when panelists are stumped.
Two very good questions and very difficult to answer. I mean, but I wish there was a magic bullet to Melissa's question. I think that here there is no single point of leverage, but that one has to engage in trying a sort of trial and error combination of measures to use every possible avenue to try to pressure the government, a government that is uninterested in the topic, and how you bring one to be an interest usually involves increasing the price for indifference. I think that Guru's point about the fact that there is no democratic incentive internally for the government is completely right, and that this is a function of the way in which the government has structured ethnic politics and the attendant divisions. And it is sad, but it has been very successful in doing that traditionally. The international community has a very difficult time in situations of this sort. Sri Lanka is by far not the only ethnically divided situation in which mass human rights abuses have taken place, which the international community finds it very, very difficult to deal with it. So I think that, again, my suggestion is without a magic bullet, you need a combination of measures. And to Gauri's question about whether the Human Rights Council will radically change course, I wouldn't go that far. I am afraid that the Human Rights Council has dynamics that are long-standing and that make member states traditionally very reluctant to criticize each other too much. But I also want to stress that there is a bit of movement, that it is up to member states and civil society pushing member states to take advantage of these new mechanisms, including, for example, renewed interest in using the Universal Periodic Review in order to stress human rights compliance topics. So there again, a combination of measures and using every possible avenue of leverage. I think it's the only alternative that is open right now, short of looking for alternatives outside UN channels. And that includes, from my standpoint, universal jurisdiction cases, economic sanctions, etc., etc.
Anyone else want to weigh in?
Yeah, just to add to that, I wonder, sorry, I think one of the kind of avenues of pressure that maybe we don't think about often enough is through the finances, the IMF, World Bank, liquidity, right? Which individual member states can, through banking regulations, through the IMF, effect, and that is a real pressure point. And just Gauri's question about the UNHRC, I mean, I don't know much about the dynamics of the UNHRC, but what I do think is that this recent report really opens up the possibilities for advocacy to go to individual member states where there are networks of support and say, look, the UNHRC, this were the recommendations, they didn't go far enough, but you can do more, right? Mm-hmm. The report asks you to do more, in fact. And so it's one of these beneficial side effects that, can come from something being at the UNHRC, even if it doesn't always go as far forward as people would like.
Great, thank you. I'm going to lump two more questions that have come in through the YouTube channel. First is, what are the prospects for a dedicated ad hoc tribunal, similar to what we saw in the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda? And maybe we can add to that Cambodia, Sri Lanka, other states that have been the subject of an ad hoc tribunal. And then to the point about what are the dynamics at the council, we have a question about what are the dynamics of the council and what has led to the wording of some of these resolutions, which speak about ethnic persecution, but don't necessarily identify Tamil, for example, as the target of that. And then the period covered, particularly in the period covered by the OISL, which is the investigative mechanism created by the High Commissioner's Office. Compare this, says the author or the questioner, compare this with resolutions on Myanmar and the Rohingya and other minorities. Is there a problem with states from the global south? What are the dynamics that are contributing to the difference in the treatment of Sri Lanka with other states such as Myanmar? So first, a question about the prospects for an international tribunal, and second, just looking at some of the wording and why the wording has been more opaque than with respect to other situations where the survivor-victim community is identified directly.
I'm not sure that I should go first.
You're the only one who's unmuted yourself, Pablo. So
yet again, so no, I mean, so and here obviously the first question is asks us to speculate, and in that character, I would say that the prospects for an international tribunal with respect to any case, not just Sri Lanka, are very dim right now. I don't think that the international community has a great deal of appetite for the establishment of this. I don't think that there is enough agreement within the Security Council about any particular case. I don't think that there's an appetite for bearing the costs of such exercises. So to be perfectly honest, and again in the spirit of speculation, I don't think that that's where I would put my bets. I think that it is interesting that the High Commissioner's report talks about an evidence gathering mechanism of the sort that has been established, for example, for Myanmar by the General Assembly. And I think that that's an interesting alternative that, in my mind, deserves to be fully explored and in fact supported, because it may be a prelude to further action when the circumstances are different. On the question about the specific language of resolutions, to be perfectly honest, I don't have a good answer to that because I don't know the history. I would be, and perhaps people in the panel and elsewhere will disagree with me, I would be surprised if the omission of the reference to Tamils was a deliberate one in past resolutions, to be perfectly frank. In other words, I don't think that there is in the drafting of documents of this sort, for example, a significantly different reaction to the Rohingyas in Myanmar versus the Tamils in Sri Lanka. In other words, I don't read into the omission something incredibly significant, but I may be wrong. And I want to insist, I have not participated in the drafting of this document, so I'm not talking here about this from personal experience. It's an interesting question, nevertheless, and worth looking into.
Sorry, can I, Beth? Yeah, so in terms of, I might have got cut off when I was speaking last, but just to sort of, in terms of what, I'm not saying, just so that I'm not mistaken for calling for disengagement with the UNHRC, that's not what I'm saying, right? What I'm calling for is a much more sort of nuanced and critical engagement with these processes. And I think in terms of where Tamil activists and the Tamil community should be looking at is making clear in terms of what their goals are and what their engagement is, and to make sure that whatever terms in which external actors want to engage with them, that they are very clear about what those terms of engagement are, and in terms of taking forward the struggle for accountability and justice. And I think that is where the political and civil society groups and the victim communities need to come together, think through this carefully and strategically, and find out ways to move this forward along with the diaspora. And in terms of, and I agree with Pablo that, but right now, whether it is an ad hoc tribunal or an ICC referral, the parts don't look, the possibility of veto are big, and there is no appetite. With the existence of the ICC, there is no real appetite for ad hoc tribunals anymore either. And so that is also not something that looks rosy for Tamils. But I think what needs to be done is, that doesn't mean that we are stuck in Geneva and thinking of only options in Geneva, because those possibilities are not open. I think the creativity and the imagination and using sometimes the openings that geopolitical sort of, events give you must be capitalized and used, and that thing. In terms of the language of the resolution, I have been part of a group of people who have steadfastly put forth this criticism that there is a de-Tamilization of the narrative in Geneva. I think that goes back to the very individual-centric nature of international human rights law and international law. The sort of, debate between Lemkin and Lothar, or sort of, the different characters that they were, one pushing for genocide, the other pushing for crimes against humanity. That is also reflected, for example, so whatever genocide sort of discourse, there is an attempt to sort of, say that's restricted to the conversation around Holocaust, and any sort of an invocation of genocide after that is. So it's a deep discomfort that international human rights law discourse has, which is not only something that you find in states, but also that you find among well-meaning international lawyers, human rights practitioners, where this is affected. And I think I think this decontextualized sort of narrative that you find in Geneva in the reporting suffers from that primarily. It's also because there is it's not very different to the language that you find in the resolutions or in the reporting, even with the special procedures, where you find saying all Sri Lankans have problems, not just the Tamils, by saying that they think they can draw the Sinhalese attention to the need for accountability and justice that really hasn't worked. There is a denial to look at the uniqueness of the Tamil problem. So, for example, when you talk about militarization, there is an urge from sort of actors to talk about it in all Sri Lankan terms rather than as there being something unique about the Tamil experience there, even within that larger sort of all Sri Lankan militarization experience. So I think it is largely the training, the structure of the international system that doesn't allow you to get in where groups are always doubted, nationalist, fringe, lunatic people, and hence I think the discourse suffers from that. It's a largely again structural problem, I would say.
Great, we're basically at the end of time. Any final remarks from any of our panelists before we close? No, well, great, thank you. I apologize. I think I failed to get to a few questions in the chat. Hopefully we can continue this conversation as the Human Rights Council continues to move forward. We should have draft language emerging, which will be interesting to see. And I appreciate everyone's attention to this important issue, and please be well. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Beth, and thanks to Pearl and the other panelists. Thanks.